Thank you, Brother Bourne. Thank all the elders for the opportunity to be here. I'm humbled by that invitation, and I am so thankful to have been a part of the program and have heard some of the excellent lessons I've heard so far, and it's an honor to be before you. I could not help but think of some of the places that I've been when Brother Butts was preaching and the difference that's shown and deference to age in other countries is compared even to our own. When I went to Singapore, everybody kept referring to me as uncle. And I finally asked Brother Simboon Kwan, why do people do that? And he said, you know, brother, it is respect for older men. And at that point in my life, I didn't really cherish being thought of as an older man. As Brother Butts indicated, the mirrors begin to lie. And everybody gets old around us, but we don't. I have lived long enough to have seen people suffer and have had a little taste of it myself. And as a result of that, this book of Job has become increasingly important in my own life. When you think about life here, it is difficult. That's a short and blunt statement. But all of you brothers probably are now old enough to know that it's a true statement. And when the writer of Job picked up his stylus to pen these words so long ago, he could just as well have said, life is unfair. You cannot argue the point that life is punctuated with hardships and heartaches and difficulties and trials. Nobody can successfully argue against that fact. And most people learn relatively soon to accept that there are some difficult episodes, but it's those unfair things that are hard to accept. Something deep within makes it almost intolerable to accept an outcome that we know is unjust. Our drive for justice overrides our patience with pain unjustly inflicted. Nevertheless, life is not simply difficult. It is also unfair. And with that recognition, I say, welcome to Job's world. Without realizing it, perhaps you have just stepped onto his turf. And amazingly, there are people that think we should study that book or books like it because they're irrelevant. How ignorant. Not only is Job's story relevant, it represents one of the oldest pieces of literature in the world. It is very ancient. Many scholars would date it in the time of Genesis. I'll tell you that my approach to it is to just read it as it is and not try to find a lot of symbolism and a lot of things that are not there. I believe it is a straightforward narrative that God gives us of things that we seldom have been given insight into so that we might be helped and strengthened and encouraged in times of trial, and I'll present it that way. In light of Job's great antiquity, it falls in the days of the patriarchs. One of the surprises that comes in life is the realization that there is not necessarily a correlation or a connection between the wrongs that we commit and the pains that we experience. I have had the sad experience of seeing people deceased who were the subject of wickedness and evil and were not guilty. An even greater surprise comes along when we realize that not only is our experience and the amount of pain we suffer not necessarily connected, but that in fact when we do right, we can suffer for it sometimes. That we're not always rewarded for doing the honorable thing. We can do the best that we can. And as we reach out to receive the award out of the blue, we get hammered. Catastrophe strikes. Those words describe what happened to the great patriarch Job. His life did not suddenly just become difficult, it became grossly unfair. As you look at these two chapters, I hope you've turned to Job chapters 1 and 2 because I want to work there. The story begins with the resume of a remarkably fine man. And he may become our hero of endurance as we look at it, but we need to remember that he's just a man. He's not Superman. He's not an angel come down in human form. Job is simply a man. Yet, and Chapter 1, at verse 1, the Scriptures record, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. Now, that does not mean that he was sinlessly perfect. It means that he didn't compromise with evil, not even with himself. He was a man whose business dealings were conducted in an upstanding way with great integrity. He kept his word. He did what he said. He dealt with other people fairly. And as a result of that, he's respected by everybody around him, whether they're in his family or not. He's upright. He held God in respect, and he consistently resisted the evil. And speaking of his family, we learn that he is blessed with 7 strong sons and 3 daughters. By the time Job's story is told, all 10 of these children are grown, and his life is at its zenith, at its apex. By now, he has amassed a remarkable fortune, many, many earthly possessions. Among those possessions, there were 7,000 sheep. Much of the wool would have been sold, no doubt, on the market. That which was kept would be woven into clothes for his family and his servants. It would be warm in the winter. The family's food was provided partially from this flock of sheep, this vast flock, and from many, many acres of crops in the field. There were 3,000 camels. I would expect that he ran a freight business with that many camels. There were caravans that went east and west, and surely those camels were for hire and provided personal transportation as well as a great amount of income. There are 1,000 oxen yoked together, preparing the fields, preparing for planting of the seed that would later be harvested in rich and abundant harvest. 500 female donkeys. One source that I read indicated that in antiquity, female donkeys provided a great delicacy of the time, donkey milk. Boy, doesn't that sound appealing. Now, over and above those things was a happy, healthy family. 10 adult children, faithful children from all indications, living close by. No more diapers to change, neither Job nor Mrs. Job. No baths to give, no camel pools to try to keep up with because there weren't car pools. No big meals to prepare. No kids running through the house, throwing things around and making a lot of racket. No lunches for school. No yard apes going to show up there with tattoos up both arms to pick your daughter up for a date. No teenage daughter with a nose ring or her belly button pierced. All those challenges of the difficult years are behind Job and his wife, and he has it made. And amazingly, nobody's criticizing him. Some of my brethren had not yet been born. Nothing about him to criticize. Job's healthy, he's wealthy, he's good, he's godly, and he's not out of touch. He has a great and deep concern for his children, though they be grown, verses 4 and 5. Now his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the day of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that one of my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. By offering those 10 burnt offerings in the name of each young adult, he shows that he is concerned. And he's concerned that there might even have been a bit of disobedience in their heart. And so he prays for them and he sacrifices on their behalf. He's diligent deep within, spiritually sensitive, not only regarding his own relationship with God, but that of his adult children. He's a praying man, a pure man, a priestly man. What a man is this man, Job. And the finishing touch to that happy scene is a godly parent making sure that all things are well among his children. Then the scene changes suddenly at verse 5 of chapter 1. There must have been a pause there. If it had been a novel, you would turn the page and begin the next chapter. If it had been a stage production, the curtain would have come down, there would have been a break, and then it opened on the next scene. But the Bible doesn't contain those kinds of markers, and so you just go from verse 5 to verse 6. Verses 1 through 5 are filled with good news, wonderful blessings, business integrity, purity of heart, professional respect all about. As Job goes to sleep, another scene opens, one that we rarely have any insight into. Job knows nothing about what's going to take place, as you and I do not know about these kinds of things today, except for this one little glimpse. Suddenly, things change. I am convinced that similar things are probably happening in our lives, maybe even today. While we are unaware and unable to perceive, God is carrying out His plan. He permits things to get underway that we would never expect. Without Job's knowledge, something happens in the heavenlies. We're transported to a called council meeting of God and His sons. And consider the difference between the opening of Job 1 in verse 1 and Job 1 in verse 6. There was a man, there was a day. There was a man who lived on earth, there was a day in God's counsel. And we're lifted from earth's familiar surroundings to a place where God is present. And the only ones comfortable there are the seraphim, who are filling the presence of the living God with the movement of their mighty wings. And their ever-present attendants of the Almighty, called in verse 6 the sons of God. And as the Lord looks about, He sees His angelic servants gathered there, because He's called them to present themselves and to give an accounting. And why not? They are accountable to Him. They do His bidding. They carry out His will. And present among them is the adversary. He's certainly not among the elect angels. He's identified in the Hebrew text as the Satan. Ha-Shatan. Every time the name Satan appears in the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, it is the Satan. What does that mean? Most often, Hebrew words originate with the verb form. Shatan means to be an adversary, to resist. Therefore, in the noun form, it is often translated the adversary or the accuser. He accuses God's people day and night. He is our adversary. And he too appears before God among the other angels. I hope that you'll pause with me and remember very well that Satan is not some little red imp that appears on the label of a potted meat can. He's not some little cartoonish character that carries a pitchfork and sits atop your shoulder and whispers ugly suggestions into your ear. That is a medieval caricature that he would love for you to accept. Satan is one of the most attractive, one of the most powerful, one of the most brilliant archangels ever created. He has lost no brilliance or power, and certainly not appealing beauty. But he is malevolent, and he is vulgar, and he's vicious within his spirit. He is insidious. And his favorite methodology is the one he employs here behind the scenes, deceptive. Because he is not visible does not mean that he doesn't exist. HIV virus is not visible, but it's killed and will kill millions. Never think that an enemy that's unseen is not present. One of the rules of war is that if an attack is proceeding too smoothly, it's because you're in an ambush. Satan has a personality. He has volition. He's engaged in a relentless campaign to destroy God's people. And this insidious adversary is compelled to appear before God. Why not? Is he not accountable to God? Some commentators have problems with that. God can call anybody he wants to, anytime he wants to, anywhere he wants to call them. Notice the plan, verses 7 through 12 of chapter 1. It's a dialogue that's very interesting. You don't find it anywhere else in the Bible. The Lord calls Satan to account. From where do you come? Don't misread that question. God's all-knowing. It might be translated something like this. Tell me what you've been about. Satan's answer is brief and impudent. From going to and fro in the earth and from walking back and forth on it. He is the prince of the air, Paul tells us in Ephesians 2. The adversary has access to this planet as well as some limited access to the presence of God when God calls for him. And he moves all about the earth as do his forces. And he has random access to any portion of this land or all the lands that exist upon this planet. And he is not held in check by the earthly elements in the same way that you and I are. Being supernatural, he can move instantly from Asia to Africa. He can leave Australia and be in Santiago, Chile in a moment. And when Satan says, I have been roaming about on the earth, he means that literally. And the Lord asks, have you considered my servant Job, verse 8? What a wonderful title he gives to Job. My servant. Job is considered, and rightly so it would seem, the greatest of all the people of the East, according to verse 3. But the most wonderful thing about Job is that he is the servant of God Almighty. Known far and wide, but he's no celebrity before the Lord, and he has no pride in his heart. God's evaluation of him is impressive. There is none like him on the earth. A blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. Hearing the word evil, the source of evil, then speaks at verse 9, does Job fear God for nothing? In our words, he would say, look, Lord, you're treating him with kid gloves. You're giving him penthouse perks. Verse 10, he continues, have you not made a hedge about him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? Consider the categories. You've protected his body from illness. You've protected his family from harm. You've protected his possessions from destruction. He's got it made. There's a divine wall around him. It's enviable. And so the adversary claims divine favoritism. You've blessed him like no other. Who wouldn't worship you? Here we see the accuser's personality. He has an intellect because he can converse with God himself. He has emotions because he's antagonistic towards Job, as well as God. He has volition because he proposes to destroy Job in the hopes of disgracing God. Satan's greatest hope is that he can lay this man low. Verse 11, but now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. You bring him down to the dirt where everybody else lives, and you'll find out what Job's made out of. He'll turn on you in a heartbeat. It's a clever plan. It's also grossly unfair. Job doesn't deserve even a suggestion, a hint of mistreatment. He walks with God. He serves God, but none of that impresses the adversary. Evil suspicions prompt what he says. You want to know what he's really made of? Remove all this indulgent treatment, all this pervasive protection. Strip away the veneer of his physical comfort, and you'll see right away that he'll turn on you. That's Satan's prediction. Instead of treating him like an indulged little child, why don't you treat him like any other man on the earth? Let him go through the death of a child. Let him lose his precious possessions. Let all that hit him with full force. You'll see what he's made out of. So Satan's point's clear. Job's worshiping you because of what he gets out of it. It's not because you are first in his life. Let me have a little crack at him. The Lord's heard enough by verse 12, and he says, behold, all that he has is in your power. Now you hold that thought for just a moment. What a horrifying thought. And you need to read those words again and again, slowly looking and considering the permission slip that God just gave the adversary. All that he has is yours to deal with, but he adds a caveat. Only do not lay a hand on his person. Verse 12. Do not touch his life. Do not touch his body. Do not touch his mind. Do not touch his soul. Everything else is yours. You can attack. You can remove the possessions. You can attack his family, but leave him alone. Satan departs from the Lord's presence. Remember, Job doesn't know anything about this. Doesn't know a thing about it, just like you and I do not know what discussions may take place concerning our lives. The first wave of the assault begins in verse 12. Pretend you've never seen that passage. Here's the turning point. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. He doesn't waste any time. Now there's a day, verse 13, we learn that all of Job's children have gathered in their brother's house for a family gathering. Job, the good father's praying for them. Perhaps he's worried that one of them's drifting. As you would expect, Job prays. At the same time, if you're to look out Job's window, there are the oxen plowing, preparing the fields. It's a beautiful day. The clouds are just wafting on the breeze. Sheep are grazing in the pasture. The donkeys are nearby. The camels are being loaded for their next trip. Servants are moving about, working hard with these animals that they know by name. And in the oldest son's house, the brothers and sisters are enjoying a delightful time there together. Their faithful father doesn't have the slightest idea about what he's going to face. But in the cosmic realm, Satan departed, and now it happens. There's a bang at the door, and when Job opens that door, his life will never be the same. It's like a chilling phone call that you get in the middle of the night, a rap at the door that you haven't expected. It's like receiving an unannounced visit from someone wearing a uniform. The master opens the door, and the messenger bursts in without invitation, winded, sobbing uncontrollably. With unrestrained passion, he pours forth the oxen. Our oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding near them, and those folks from Sheba attacked us, Master. We've talked about the possibility that they would come, and they have, and they've assaulted us. They took the animals, and they killed your servants, and I alone have escaped. And while he is still speaking, another plunges in. Without hesitation, he screams. There was a bolt of lightning. It's like fire from heaven, and in an instant it consumed all the sheep and all the field hands who were there, and I alone have survived. And that's not all. Another servant pushes past that one and grabs Job and says, Master, you wouldn't believe it, but there were 3 raids from the Chaldeans, and they have hit that area where the camels were being prepared for a caravan, and they have left with the animals and murdered thy servants, and I alone am here. And as he stumbles back, trying to regain some composure, maybe he's thinking, well, at least I've got my children. And interrupting that previous servant, another comes in and says, Master Job, your sons and your daughters, they're all gone. There was a fierce tornado in the area, and it hit your son's house, and it just exploded, and they were killed. Now you force yourself, if you can, to picture that horrific scene. Just try to imagine it. Job loses all his precious children in a freak storm that came from nowhere for no apparent reason. For the first time in 30 or 40 years, Job and his wife are childless. Further, God hid from Job and his wife the meaning of this confusing disaster. He provides no explanation. At this juncture, he offers no comfort. The silence of heaven at this point becomes more unbearable than the news they've received. Upon reading that biblical account, when you arrive at the end of the episode where these 4 trembling messengers have poured out their reports, you have to try to pause and let that grief sink in. What a temptation in an hour like that to let your emotions just run wild. This is life at its lowest ebb. This is the end of the line. This is the bottom of the well. This is like sitting across from someone who has been apprehended and taken into custody because he's killed his family, and he's trying to come to grips with the enormity of the sin that he's committed, or worse than that. It is like meeting the father on the other side who's had his family destroyed by some savage beast of a man for no reason whatsoever. Or worse still, it's like receiving that news about your family. The only one taking pleasure in that scene is Satan and his host. And he and his demons are on the edge of their seat in the realm of the wicked. And they're watching anxiously. They anticipate the venom and the bile that will come forth from Job's lips. And they're thinking he cannot endure this without cursing God, spoiled little man that he is, and we've taken that from him. We left him with nothing. Now we're going to see what he is, what he really is. And indeed we do. Because in verses 20 through 22, we have recorded, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. When Job spoke, what a remarkable thing he said. And the Hebrew text, verse 20, comprises 9 words. And they describe what Job did before they tell us what he said. First, he peeled himself from the ground. He arose, And the next verb tells us something strange. He tore his robe. It is the action of a man in anguish. It is used several times in the Old Testament to indicate utter grief. And then the third verb says he shaved his head. The shaving of one's head in that time was an indication of the loss of personal glory. And the fourth action that he takes is fall to the ground. Now understand, this is not a collapse of grief. Job does not wallow and wail, though he might be expected to. Job worships. The Hebrew verb means to fall prostrate in utter submission and worship. In the ancient times, this was considered the sincerest expression of obeisance and submission to the Almighty Creator. By now, the only one cussing is Satan. We say cussing in Mississippi, where I'm from, not cursing. He resented Job's response. He hated it, hated Job. Of all things, I do that to him, and he worships God, worships the God who would allow this. And the wicked spirits are at a loss as they watch this man responding to terrible adversity with adoration, who concludes all of his woes with worship, and they don't know what to do. There's no blame, there's no bitterness, there's no cursing, there's no shaking your fist towards heaven, none of that. Instead, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That pretty well says it all. I've been present for the birth of 2 babies, and I'm told that every one of them's naked when they get here. Mine were. And I've actually been present when bodies were prepared for burial, and you leave out the same way. Blessed be his name for loaning all of that to me while I had it, and blessed be his name for calling it to himself. Now get that closely. Get it, North Americans. Get it when you're walking through your fine house with beautiful things and driving that new SUV. It's all on loan from the Lord, every bit of it. Just face that fact. You didn't create any of it. You didn't bring anything with you. You're not going to take anything with you. You don't own anything. You don't even own the children that you had. They're God's children. He loaned them to you to love and to nurture and to discipline and to encourage and to affirm and then to release to serve God. Remember what Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these things we shall be content. There's nothing wrong with having a nice place. Nothing wrong with filling it with nice things. But the problem comes, and the problem is so very apparent in our land of plenty. The problem comes when the things possess us. And I want you to get this. Things never owned Job. And perhaps without even realizing it, Job, by his actions and his words, in essence said, in your face, Satan, I never put my trust in any of the things that God gave me. I've understood from the day that my first child was born that they're God's children. He gave them all. He can take them all back when he wants them back. That explains how, in that circumstance, Job could say, in all sincerity, blessed be the name of the Lord. Since he never considered himself the sole owner of those children and those goods, he didn't struggle, as others might, in releasing what was God's to the owner when he claimed it. When you understand that everything you have is on loan, you're better prepared when he calls it back to himself. The second wave begins in chapter 2. When bad things happen, I have learned that they often happen to the wrong people. Sometimes me. And seriously, haven't you seen bad things happen to the wrong people? I've been at the scene where a slobbering drunk came out of an accident unscathed, and there'd be a family laying dead in the road. Shouldn't have happened that way in Lindell's world, but it does. And when those kinds of things happen, we're left with that one-word question, why? And that question is being answered, or asked, I should say, all across the Metroplex this morning in every hospital there is in this community, and there are many. Why? Every community's got homes plagued by that same question, and they're not getting any more answer than Job did. Read Job 2, 1 through 10. Notice the word destroy in the New King James. The New American Standard Updated has ruin. And as it's used there, it's to carry the idea of scraping away. You urge me to scrape away at him without a cause. And Satan, not one to be outdone, answers impudently, absolutely, skin for skin. Yeah, that's what a man will do. He'll give anything to protect his life, but you've still got a hedge around him. Give me the freedom to break him down to the deepest level by taking his health away from him, and he will curse you to your face. I think the adversary says that because he's mad. I think his temper's got away from him, and he's in a murderous rage. Read what the Lord's response is. Behold, he's in your hand, but spare his life. Verse 6 of chapter 2. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine your name connected with such an agreement? Because it might be sometime. God might say, have you considered my servant, and put your own name there. All right, Satan, go after him. Just don't kill him. God again sets the boundary. Preserve his life, but he's fair game otherwise. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Verse 7. Medical doctors have been and are curious about this affliction. It's perplexed them for centuries. I've seen in the research that I did, seen it called smallpox, elephantiasis, chronic eczema, leprosy, psoriasis, keratosis, and even melanoma. Satan didn't waste any time. He went out and struck Job. And when you examine the whole book, there's this list of symptoms. It's just unimaginable. Inflamed ulcerous sores, persistent maddening itching, degenerative changes in facial flesh, disfiguration, loss of appetite, fears and depression, purulent sores that burst open, scab over, crack and ooze pus, worms forming in those sores, difficulty breathing, darkening eyelids, foul breath, loss of weight, excruciating and continual pain, high fever with chills, discoloration of the skin, chronic intense diarrhea, and horrible anxieties. And additionally, Job endured delirium and sleeplessness and the rejection of his friends, and that lasts for months. And it results in him being rejected and isolated and relocated to what we would call the city dump. It is a place where garbage and rubbish and human excrement was burned. Complete confusion, total isolation, unbearable pain, no hope of change, sitting in filth, removed from all comforts, and God's not mad at him. God's not mad at him. You can remove his possessions, you can attack his family, but you leave the man himself alone. Satan departs from the Lord's presence. And remember, Job knows nothing about this discussion. My. Job enters a land where real heroes are made here. It's an amazing story. A story we ought to take time to think about. The day came when Job's wife was overwhelmed. Perhaps this was the most difficult of all. Do you still hold your integrity? Curse God and die. She was wrong. She drew the wrong conclusion. She gave foolish advice, but think about how she got there. This lady lost 10 children. Until you've lost your children, you be really slow about judging too harshly somebody that lashes out in the depths of that kind of grief. Who knows what somebody might say on the backwash of that kind of a loss. She suffered. She suffered the loss of wealth. She suffered the loss of position. There are many benefits and perks associated with being Miss Job. She's no longer the first lady of the community. She's no longer honored. She's destitute. She's lost her companion. Job's response is magnificent. You speak as one of the foolish women. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. He went much further than reproof, but he asked this question. Excellent question. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? That's a rare insight, not only in antiquity, but today as well. It is a rhetorical question, not asked to be answered, but to make us think. Job is undoubtedly thinking these thoughts. Doesn't he have the right? Isn't he the potter? Aren't we the clay? Isn't he the shepherd? Aren't we the sheep? Isn't he the master? Aren't we the servants? Isn't that the way that it works? And I love this last line. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. There's absolute trust in this man. Well, we come to that scene and look at that, and there are some principles of life that I want to share with you very quickly. Number one, we encounter an enemy that we cannot see, but that does not mean that he's not real. He's here. He's a supernatural adversary, and we encounter him and his servants regularly. Do not take him lightly. Secondly, we endure trials that we do not deserve, but God permits them. It's like he did with Job. And that is a mystery of God's unfathomable will, and we'll never fully explain it and understand it. And if you don't accept that, then you will become increasingly confused and resentful and bitter. And when that happens, Satan will have won. Accept the truth that we don't understand everything here. Endure the trials that God permits with the realization that you can prevail. Because there has no temptation taken a man, but such as is common to mankind, and God will with the temptation also make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. There is a plan that we explore while we're here that we do not understand, but it is best. Not every segment of it is pleasant, not every segment of the plan is fair, but we rest in the realization that the one who's in control knows and does what is best. We experience consequences that we could not anticipate, but they're necessary. They're necessary for our spiritual development. They're necessary given the choices we've made. We often create a great deal of our reality. And the only thing we have control over is how we respond to life. Respond well. Since life is full of trials, we must always recognize there are more to come. Job says, yet a man is born of trouble, and as the sparks fly upward, Job 5, verse 7. He's correct. Trials are inevitable. Be ready for them. Don't think them strange. They are the rule, not the exception. Since our world is fallen and broken, we must understand that those who love us may offer unprofitable advice. No matter where the advice comes from, check it with what the Word of God says and stand on God's book. Since God is sovereign, we must prepare for blessing as well as adversity. Because He is God, He's unpredictable. You just be ready. Now, as the story of life unfolds, it's not only difficult, but it becomes unfair. And the silence of God may make you wonder, is He there and does He care? Let me assure you, He is there and He does care. He cared so much that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The only way to be ready for the adversities and the trials that this life brings is to be in Christ. I trust that if you're not, you'll make arrangements to be before this day is over. May God bless you in your house.